So good morning. Welcome to the Humanist Community in Silicon Valley Sunday Forum. My name is Matt Courtney. I'm a recorder and a member of the board of the Humanist Community. The Humanist Community is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. Humanism is a reality-based philosophy of life that affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. We value freedom, health, happiness, fairness, compassion, and using science and reason to acquire and apply knowledge. If these words describe your thinking, we invite you to become a member of the Humanist Community if you have not already done so. Membership forms are available on our website at humanist.org. If you are listening for the first time, welcome, and we invite you to continue listening to our weekly forums and other events. You can find all our events listed on the website, again, humanists.org. Please aid us in continuing to present these forums by donating to the Humanist Community. You can find out how to donate to our organization on the website, humanists.org. Speakers today are Reverend Rowan Fairgrove and Masen Ewald. Hopefully I pronounced everybody's name properly. But they will discuss the Poor People's Campaign, its past, present, and how to get involved in the modern campaign. So let me unmute everybody that is speaking.
Thank you, Matthew. Okay, welcome to my talk. This is an incredibly rich topic, and I'm not going to be able to cover anything like the breadth of the history and what we've been up to for the last 5 years, but I'm going to talk about the national organization, its origins and philosophy, a little bit about state organizing, and then share some recent local actions and how you can get involved. In 1968, 67, 68, leaders came together to forge a campaign to lift the unjust economic conditions facing millions of people worldwide. In Reverend King's last Sunday sermon, he said, "We are coming to Washington in a poor people's campaign. Yes, we are going to bring the tired, the poor, the huddled masses. We are coming to demand that the government address itself to the problem of poverty. We read one day, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if a man doesn't have a job or an income, he has neither life nor liberty, nor the possibility of the pursuit of happiness. He merely exists. We come to ask America to be true to the huge promissory note that it signed years ago, and we are coming to engage in dramatic, nonviolent action to call attention to the gulf between the promise and fulfillment, to make the invisible visible." As a first step in building the power needed to achieve the goal of radical redistribution of political and economic power, Dr. King, along with other leaders of the poor, such as Johnny Tillman of the National Welfare Rights Organization, helped work out major elements of the platform of the Poor People's Campaign of 1968. Those simple tenets of the campaign, seen on the screen: feed the hungry, hire the jobless, and most of all, at the end, respect poor people. I can't help but wonder how things would be 50 years later if these platform planks had been adopted by the wider society. Unfortunately, the unity and organization needed for the Poor People's Campaign of 1968 to complete all three of the planned stages and form the new unsettling force capable of disrupting, quote, complacent national life, end quote, and achieving an economic Bill of Rights was not easy to come by. The assassinations of Dr. King and Senator Robert Kennedy, a key proponent of the campaign and presidential candidate, served to cripple the campaign and greatly limit its impact. Nonetheless, despite these setbacks due to political violence and assassinations, as well as the difficulties of sustaining a national movement, the Poor People's Campaign of 1968 had an impact, not only on governmental policies, but also on public perceptions. The campaign pushed Congress and federal agencies to allocate millions for programs such as Head Start and education welfare services for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, while it also helped catalyze the desegregation of schools and extension of labor programs. Significantly, the campaign introduced strategies for protest and social change. The movement also helped transform national discussions on race, class, economic opportunities, security, and democracy. The year 1968 represented a transformative period in American history as the civil rights movement began addressing human rights issues across boundaries nationwide. And to give you we in the modern campaign aim to stand on the shoulders of those who came before and put effort into learning lessons and getting into step together. To give you a glimpse of the modern origins of the Poor People's Campaign and National Call for Moral Revival, we'll start with a video of a 2018 interview from PBS with Judy Woodruff interviewing Reverend Dr. Barber.
Next, an effort to revive a famous movement of the 1960s focused on reducing poverty, inequality, and tackling social justice. But with such a broad agenda, will it find enough support at this polarized time? We start with a look at the campaign that began 50 years ago. Shortly before his death in 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. expanded his civil rights campaign to include calls for economic justice. He called for an economic revolution that included protection and services for the poorest Americans. He would call it the Poor People's Campaign.
We are coming to get our check.
The campaign would bring together poor people from across the country and from across racial, ethnic, and geographic lines, including poor whites, for a march on Washington.
Even if you have to bring a whole family, we are going to have in Washington facilities, and we're going to have food, and we are going to demand that the government do something about these conditions.
The first step was to construct a shanty town called Resurrection City on the National Mall, housing thousands of participants in a form of nonviolent civil disobedience. Dr. King himself would never make it to the March on Washington. He died that spring. But weeks after his assassination, 50,000 people gathered in solidarity, demanding economic reform on the steps where Dr. King had professed, "I have a dream."
We come with an appeal to open the doors of America to the almost 50 million Americans who have not been given a fair share of America's wealth and opportunity.
Half a century later, a group of religious and moral leaders are planning a wave of civil disobedience in Washington, a revival of the Poor People's Campaign. It is headed in part by the Reverend William Barber, who's the co-chair of the campaign. He led demonstrators at a rally in front of the U.S. Capitol this month, and he was arrested, alongside the Reverend Jesse Jackson, a key figure in the 1968 movement. I spoke with Reverend Barber recently when he was in Washington. Reverend William Barber, welcome to the NewsHour. Thank you very much for joining us. When the original Poor People's Campaign took place, it was 50 years ago. Dr. Martin Luther King was involved. After he was assassinated, it continued. But what is the connection between then and now?
Well, thank you so much for having us. And on behalf of the campaign, the National Poor People's Campaign, National Call for Moral Revival, and my co-chair, Reverend Dr. Theoharis, let me say that the connection was, first of all, that it did continue. That people realized Dr. King was right. Racism, poverty, and militarism were interconnected. The connection today is we did a study. We commissioned a study with the Institute for Policy Studies and also had some help with Urban Institute, anecdotal and empirical data. And we did something called the Souls of Poor Folk, auditing America 50 years after the Poor People's Campaign. What did we find? Today, there are 140 million poor and low wealth people. Today, there are 250,000 people that die every year from low wealth. We have less voting rights today because of the gutting of the Voting Rights Act than we had in 1965. We have 62 million people who are working poor, who work for less than a living wage, and 14 million children who are in poverty.
Those numbers are overwhelming. They are daunting. You're not proposing to do away with poverty, are you?
We are saying that there are 5 interlocking injustices that America has to face because they continue to cause policy violence. That is systemic racism, particularly seen through the lens of voter suppression, where people use voter suppression to get elected, and then once they get elected, they pass policies that hurt the poor, mostly white women, children, and the working poor. Systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy and militarism, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism that says you don't have to address those issues. We are saying, yes, America is going to have to face these 5 interlocking injustices and change them.
Why can't you work through the existing political system, work to elect political figures who agree with your agenda?
Well, several reasons. Number one, we had 26 presidential debates in the last presidential election. On the Democrat and Republican side, not 1 hour was spent on poverty. Not 1 hour was spent on voter suppression and restoring the Voting Rights Act. Not 1 hour on the war economy and militarism. So if we're not even having the conversation, the first thing we have to change is the attention violence. We have an attention violence when it comes to poverty and the poor, and we must change that before you can change the agenda. And it must be a movement of the people from the bottom up.
Reverend Barber, I talk to people, I've read folks who agree with much of what you are saying you want, but they also are saying you're asking for too many different things, that you should narrow your list of ambitions, that you'll have a much better chance at getting something done.
Well, then those same people should say narrow the Constitution because it's pretty ambitious. It says domestic tranquility, establishment of justice, providing for the common defense, promoting the welfare, general welfare. Narrow the moral call of the Bible that says you're supposed to care for the stranger, the hungry, the sick, the left out, the lonely, the imprisoned. Why is it that the wealthy and greed gets to ask for everything? They want tax cuts, they get that. They want to block health care, they get that. But then we tell poor people, you have to ask for one thing. 37 million people without health care, we have to fight for health care. Millions of people without living wages. We can't just ask for one thing because they are systemically interlocking injustices.
If there are so many who you define as poor in this country, why aren't we seeing more people rise up and make this argument? I mean, it's right now it's left to you and a relatively small group of people who are making this argument, having the march, having your demonstrations and so forth.
Well, I don't know if I would say a relatively small group. We have organizing committees in 40 states. We have people who are organizing. In the last 2 weeks, we've had thousands of people attend. Over nearly 2,000 people do civil disobedience, more than ever in the history of this country, simultaneously doing nonviolent moral fusion, civil disobedience. There is a rising, and so what we're doing is we're launching a movement. We're not ending a movement. We're launching a movement and calling people to action. Many people do not know how bad it is. And many people who are poor and low wealth have been broken and pushed down and ignored. But where we're going from West Virginia to Wisconsin, from Alabama to Alaska, we're finding that there are thousands of people who are saying it's time for us to stand up and refuse to be silent.
You've said that the nation's problem is not that we don't have enough money. You said it's that we don't have the moral capacity to face what ails society. What did you mean by that?
That when you look at our deepest moral framework of the Constitution and our deepest moral values of our religious tradition, we too often have a political conversation that talks about left versus right, military or middle class. That's too puny. It's too narrow. 43.5% of this country is poor and low wealth. People are dying. Even Joseph Stiglitz, the economist, said that America has to face the cost of inequality. What I'm saying is we can't just have a left-right argument anymore. We need to have a deeply moral argument that says this is not just about Democrats or Republicans. This is about America. What kind of democracy do we want to be? You cannot have a democracy continue to exist when 400 people make an average of $97,000 an hour and you lock people up who simply want 15 in the union.
Does either political party come closer to your goals?
Well, I think they can. I think they hit at it. I think, of course, the extremists who have taken over the Republican Party have just gone so far extreme. You know, they're more focused on tax cuts to the wealthy. They want to blame poor people for their problems. Democrats, on the other hand, are willing to talk about, say, the Affordable Care Act and talk about the middle class. But the reality is neither party is willing to put right in front of America the issues of systemic racism, of systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and say the word poverty. It's almost as though we've tried to remove even saying the word poverty, when in fact the majority of the poor people in this country are white, women, children, working people, and the disabled. So we have to change our narrative in this country. And the only way you can change the narrative is to change the narrator. That's why this campaign is focused on three things: breaking through the narrative, massive voter mobilization among the poor, and power building from the bottom up.
Reverend William Barber, the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign in 2018. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Next.
So that was in 2018. In 2020, we have organizing committees in 46 states, I believe. And even more people, due to the pandemic, are poor than before. So it's over 45% of Americans fall below the poverty line. Dr. Barber, now Bishop, I've been saying Reverend Doctor for so long, he's really started using, as you can see from his pink shirt, that he's a bishop. He was the former president of the North Carolina NAACP, and he stepped forward to pick up the baton from Dr. King, and in 2018 became the co-chair of the Modern Poor People's Campaign. He has expressed admiration for the legacy of Dr. King's commitment to interlocking injustices as the model for the intersectionality of the current campaign. As you will hear as you learn more about the campaign, these interlocking injustices include the evils of systemic racism, systemic poverty, the war economy, ecological devastation, and the distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism. Bishop Barber and the allies in the fusion movement sat in, protested, and were arrested for several years in North Carolina State House as part of the Moral Mondays protests that began in April of 2013 with 100 participants, 17 of whom were arrested. As the movement built momentum, police pegged weekly attendance at more than 2,500, and in 2014, the Moral Monday movement gathered an estimated 80,000 for a march. More than 900 demonstrators were arrested in the course of the initial Moral Mondays actions in its first year in North Carolina. In 2020, the Poor People's Campaign started holding virtual Facebook Live Moral Mondays and also live streaming on the Poor People's Campaign website. With millions of people calling Mitch McConnell to ask for COVID-19 relief, calling different senators on different issues, this coming Moral Monday, I'll talk about a little later, but is on voter suppression. And so we invite you to join our Moral Monday protests online these days. This is the 80,000 people marching in North Carolina. And I'd like to introduce you to our co-chairs. And I think actually this is where I turn it over to Masen. Maybe this is my last slide. Anyway, in 2015, Reverend Barber and others from the Moral Monday movement created Repairers of the Breach, dedicated to a moral agenda rooted in moral and constitutional values. On September 12, 2016, activists from the Moral Monday and Repairers of the Breach, the Cairo Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice, labor organizers from the Fight for 15, faith leaders like Sister Simone Campbell and Nuns on the Bus, and religious and political groups across the nation organized a Moral Day of Action with simultaneous protests in 30 states. We delivered the Higher Ground Moral Declaration to our respective state officials, and in 2016, Repairers of the Breach made a commitment to revive the Poor People's Campaign with the Cairo Center. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Masen.
Okay, hi everyone. Just give me a second here to share my screen. Okay. Let me know if you can't hear me or you can't see my slides. So After jointly announcing the launch of the new Poor People's Campaign on December 4th, 2017, co-chairs Reverend Archbishop Barber and Reverend Theoharis led hundreds in a silent, nonviolent march on the Capitol in Washington, D.C. to present a letter to the then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell condemning a recently passed budget bill. Senator McConnell refused to meet with the marchers. So one of the first things that the new Poor People's Campaign did was commission documents that would allow for our discussions to be more accurate and data-driven, part of what Bishop Barber mentioned in the interview. He emphasizes that one cannot make demands without data. So the Poor People's Campaign has undertaken and continues to conduct extensive research to create that accurate current information about poverty and about the poor. You can find links to all of the studies that the Poor People's Campaign has done on the campaign's website. As he also mentioned in that interview, the Souls of Poor Folk Moral Audit provided the data-driven analysis of the historical and empirical realities that concerning these four evils that he mentions in the past 50 years since 1968. In the 7 sections of our moral budget, which was delivered to the Congressional Budget Committee in 2019, we look at policies and investments for 7 critical areas. And those are 1, democracy and equal protection under the law; 2, domestic tranquility; 3, peace and the common defense; 4, life and health; 5, the planet; 6, our future; and 7, an equitable economy. In 2020, the campaign produced a report titled Unleashing the Power of the Poor and Low-Income Americans, which provides a closer look at the voting behaviors of millions of people relative to the size of the total electorate, as well as recent voting margins by state. So these findings support the campaign's analysis that organizing among the poor and around agenda that represents their concerns can fundamentally change the political map of the country and lead to the sort of policies that are just and representative of all Americans. So next, I'll be sharing some more info about the various bus tours and listening campaigns that have occurred over the last few years. Part of grassroots organizing is obviously to go out and listen and engage with people that are most affected by the policies that have kept poor people down. The Poor People's Campaign has taken to bus tours to engage with supporters and form state organizing committees. The video that I'll share in a moment is of the 2019 Truth and Poverty bus tour. So you see a few of those bus tours mentioned here. 2016, community leaders, clergy, 5 for 15 workers organized. In 2018, the 40 Years of More Action organized in state houses across the U.S. We'll be showing a video from the 2019 Truth and Poverty bus tour, and then most recently the More National Tour, MORE, mobilizing, organizing, registering, and educating. I'll be going into that a little later in the slides, but for now, I will show this video.
What happens in Wall Street often doesn't say a thing about what's happening on the real streets of America.
Well, there are thousands who are not free. Yeah. And we know when one person is not free, none of us are free. Yeah. And we know that this isn't the case in God's economy. That's right. It doesn't have to be this way.
That's right. That's right.
We can do better.
Yeah. We can do better. Yeah. We can do better.
In America, we are taught that if you are poor, if you are homeless, if you are dispossessed, disenfranchised, it's because you've done something wrong. It's because you are inferior. It is because you are insufficient. And we believe that that is wrong. There are 140 million people in the United States who either live in poverty or are low income, who are one paycheck away from being homeless, who are one wildfire away from being homeless, or one missed rent check or car payment away from being homeless. That's over a third of the United States. Now, to me, that is our deep shame as a country. That is a moral emergency, and that's why we need a Poor People's Campaign across the entire nation. We are identifying ourselves with this movement. And what that means is we're saying, hey, we're part of something bigger.
I understand some things about poverty because I am a poor person. We believe that when poor people name their own priorities because they know their own needs and know what needs to happen, that real change will be produced. If poor people are not allowed to speak these priorities for themselves, no one else will.
It's hard enough just to live on this earth and survive. And they shouldn't make it any more difficult. You shouldn't be homeless and be a criminal just because you're homeless. That's right. It's sad. Sad.
The homelessness that you're seeing in the streets of LA, in our community, you can see it all up and down the state. People encamped in the streets, living in their cars, in RVs, in garages. It's a growing phenomenon. And one thing that's important for me to point out, I don't think this is because people just don't know how to manage their finances. This is an economic devastation based on a systemic root.
We thought we were going off to be heroes. But what we found was that we were no more than pawns. And when we come home to live in an unjust and unequal society with the largest prison complex in the world and a political system that seeks to oppress voting rather than to expand it.
It's got to be done to help people with disabilities to vote. One of my concerns is when I went to vote, when the little sheet came out of the thing that showed what I voted for, I couldn't read it. It was in small print.
Yeah. Let the people vote! Yeah. That's how you honor veterans.
I get tired of hearing a certain false narrative. And it's that people like myself are weak, lazy, and immoral. But this is far from the truth because weak, lazy, and immoral is letting human beings live in the streets while billionaires receive trillion-dollar tax cuts.
Come on now. Come on now.
Denying health care to millions, cutting social services for the poor, and privatizing the VA while dropping bombs on brown people 1,000 miles away, diverting money from poor Americans to pay for those bombs and lying for the reasons why the bombs are even being dropped, caging immigrant children,
Come on, Mike.
ignoring ecological devastation in poor communities is weak, lazy, and immoral.
This was the site of the first of the 3 major fires that Lewiston experienced in 2013. They were all arson, and there was a lot of agreement that the fires themselves were tragic, but it surfaced this ongoing tension that we have in the community over, who we consider to be a part of our community. And many times it's not even coded. It's literally, we have too many immigrants, their homes burnt down, so let's not rebuild them because, we need less people like that here.
Look at everything the United States is doing. Look at all the wealth. That's all ours. I mean, that's all the Native American. It's easy to lose that focus because everybody came in that second chapter. But they got to go to the first chapter. The first chapter is going to tell the story of this country. And then Congress or nobody can turn away from it. So, this Poor People's Campaign needs to know that they have artillery, religious artillery that can help the movement. But if you don't recognize us, then it goes back to that second chapter that we're the forgotten ones.
There are currently more than 11,000 unaccompanied children in the care of the U.S. and Humane Services. This policy is inhumane. It is immoral. To remain silent is to be complicit.
There is no individual solution to the social and economic problems that working women face.
We do not live in a mom-friendly or child-friendly country. We face inadequate paid paternity leave, abysmal postpartum health care, equally appalling access to quality child care and public education. I feel expendable, but if I am expendable, so too are my children, and that I cannot stand for.
So we have to hold these politicians accountable. That's where our problem is. In St. John, people are not participating in these elections because these people who we elect, they are not representing us.
There's other systems here that are oppressing us that voting won't always fix, and that we've got to talk about, we've got to call it out, and we've got to mobilize and build a movement to be able to change these things that our politicians won't always change.
But I have to tell you, there's something going on in this nation right now. There's a beautiful birth of a movement, and it's going to take all of us. It's going to take all of us to stand up and say, I lived at a time when kids were going hungry and homeless, when they were closing hospitals and healthcare centers, when racists were emboldened. But I linked arms with people. I stood up and acted for justice, and we changed it. We changed it.
Forward together! One step back.
It's movement time. It's time to shake this nation, because this nation is locked up. Our politics are small and banged, but we are those who can see the cracks in the walls and the way to come out of the cells. And we are determined to be free. And we're determined to see other folk free. Free with living wages. Right? Free. Free with health care. Free. Free with food on their tables, and free with good housing, and free with good water and land and air. And free with justice. That is the call of this movement. And we are the front line.
What do we want? Justice! What do we want?
Okay.
What happens in Wall Street?
One thing I found most powerful about that video is what attracted me to the Poor People's Campaign as well was, as Bishop Barber mentioned, one of the goals is to change the narrative by changing the narrator. And I think hearing directly from, going out on listening campaigns, actively listening and learning about what's happening for people in different communities is, one of the most powerful ways to create awareness and invite other people into this kind of work. So that's a lot of what we'll be talking more about and what we're doing going forward. So the last 22 state tour was known as the We Must Do More, MORE, standing for Mobilizing, Organizing, Registering, and Educating. It was a national bus tour kicked off in June 2019, and it was meant to be ongoing until May 2020. We had a really wonderful December 2019 tour stop here in the Bay Area in San Francisco, and that was one of the last live events. During the initial chaos surrounding the pandemic, 4 states had their bus tours canceled, but soon the campaign took to Facebook Live, YouTube Live, and other virtual platforms like Zoom, and some of the local challenges were highlighted in those virtual tour stops with local testifiers, similar to what you saw and local leaders. Recordings are available if anyone's interested in those live feeds, and they're available on the Poor People Campaign National Facebook page. So now we move on to the Poor People's Campaign Congress of June 2019. There was a main event that we held the first day of the Congress, and we held a presidential forum. I believe there were 9 presidential candidates that were there. And let's see, Greg Kaufman, I'm going to read a quote from Greg Kaufman of The Nation, who summed up the forum. As for policy, there was quite a bit that the candidates agreed on: the restoration and expansion of the Voting Rights Act, universal pre-K and affordable childcare, $15 minimum wage, healthcare as a right, repealing the Trump tax cut for the wealthy, bringing the troops home from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and reallocating those billions of dollars domestically, making college affordable or free. There was also a shared sense that scarcity of resources is a myth, the United States has plenty of money to do big things. Candidates agreed broadly that Democrats must respond to the right's attempts to use race to pit poor people against one another by investing time and energy in building a multiracial coalition. Here's a little bit more information about, more generalizing what is called for in the budget. The budget challenges the idea that poverty is the fault of the poor. Instead, it finds that poverty is caused by structures and immoral policies, and therefore it will take moral policies and larger social transformation to lift the load of poverty. So we outline just, general spending cuts and revenue that can be used to accomplish other key campaign demands. These are a few photos from that Moral Congress at the actual U.S. Congressional Budget Committee, where we're presenting our budget to them on behalf of the nation. So these three images, the first one is of Reverend Liz testifying. The upper right photos of our delegation walking through the halls of Congress. And then the bottom is a wide shot of folks actually from Congress and our testifiers. So after the Congress, the plan is to spend a year organizing, mobilizing, and educating in all of our states. And then we plan to return to Washington, D.C. to demand an end to the war on the poor. But now the campaign has gone digital, and it's actually been quite successful. We've seen a lot of engagement over the past year. There was what actually drew me into the campaign more fully was a digital march last summer in 2020, which 3 million people attended online. And now I will pass it back to Reverend Rowan.
Need to stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, I'm trying here. Let's see. There we go. Sorry.
No worries. So, the current campaign that we're working on, we sort of have two prongs, and one is the Jubilee. And I thought since y'all were humanists, you might not be as familiar with the word Jubilee, other than say as the 50th anniversary, the Queen's Jubilee or something like that. So we who aren't part of Christianity and Judaism don't really understand where it came from. But in Judaism, a Jubilee year is a year of emancipation of slaves and prisoners, forgiveness of debts, restoration of alienated lands to their former owners, and rest from cultivation for all land. And this was in ancient Hebrew law to be kept every 50 years. The Catholic Church also has Jubilee years every 25 years for the remission of sins and universal pardon. In the interfaith community, Jubilee is most often about debt relief. The Parliament of the World's Religions in 2004 called for the world to declare Jubilee and relieve the burden of international debt on poorer countries. So the Poor People's Campaign Jubilee platform can be seen in that context.
Alaska to Arkansas, the Carolinas to California, Mississippi to Maine, Kansas to Kentucky, the Bronx to the border, Appalachian hollers to Apache sacred lands, people are coming together to organize their moral outrage against systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, militarism and the war economy, and the false narrative of religious nationalism into a powerful moral fusion movement.
There are
140 million people who are poor and struggling against these injustices in the richest country in the world. A society sick with these injustices needs a voice rooted in our deepest moral and constitutional values to remind us of who we are and who we must be.
A moral policy agenda to heal the nation. The Poor People's Jubilee platform proclaims that moral policy is economically sound policy. That the 140 million are not only the hope of the poor. That the least of these, who are, in actuality, most of us, can lead the nation out of the pain that it's been feeling.
The rejected are leading a moral and economic revival to save the heart and soul of this nation. Our platform is grounded in 5 principles.
We need a moral revolution of values to repair the breach in our society. This platform abides by our deepest constitutional and moral commitments to justice. Where harm has been done, it must be acknowledged and undone.
Everybody in, nobody out. Too many people are hurting, and we can't be silent anymore.
When you lift from the bottom, everybody rises. Instead of trickle down, we start with bottom up.
Prioritize the leadership of the poor, low income, and most impacted. Those who are on the front lines of these crises must also be in the lead in identifying their solutions.
Debts that cannot be paid must be relieved. We demand freedom from servicing debts that cannot be paid.
The Poor People's Jubilee platform now identifies policy and legislative priorities to heal our nation.
Sorry. For some reason, PowerPoint is having trouble.
Now invest in the welfare of all. We've been investing in systemic racism and voter suppression, but we must now invest in expanding democracy.
We have been investing in killing people. We now must invest in life.
We have been investing in the wealthy and corporations. We must now invest in the people who have built up this country and make it run every day. The 140 million and more who have been abandoned in an era of abundance.
Somebody's been hurting our people, and it's gone on far too long, and we won't be silent anymore.
We won't be silent and
not be silent anymore.
So the Jubilee Policy Platform has 5 principles, which you heard those folks talk about. A moral revolution to repair the breach, everybody in, nobody out. When you lift from the bottom, everybody rises. Prioritize the leadership of the poor, low income, and most impacted. And debts that cannot be paid must be relieved. So that's sort of the overview of the national messaging and things that we've done as a nation, although within the states, because from the bottom up, we go to our state capitals, we go to our state senators, we do it, from where we are. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of state actions. One of the things that we were doing during the pandemic was we started doing a lot of cyber organizing, as it were. And so this was Everybody's Got a Right to Live, which is one of our slogans. And we had people from all over California submit pictures of themselves holding individual letters to spell out Everybody's Got a Right to Live. And we posted it all over social media. You may be asked at some point, if you're part of the campaign, to give us a letter with to help with our messaging. We just did vote with VOTA, and vote in ASL was our most recent campaign to get letters from people. We have worked with other environmentalists trying to stop big oil from they had this bill that at the very last minute was changed so that they wouldn't be accountable for paying for cleanup. So that was a huge, very fast mobilization on the last day of the assembly to keep them from approving SB 1012. We had, for the 2020 election, we had 20,000 door hangers giving both census and voter information in English and Spanish that we distributed through neighborhoods all over the place. These photos are from LA, Sacramento, and San Jose. Our most recent state action was a Christian nationalist named Sean Foyt decided that he was going to have a worship protest event. And since the false moral narrative of religious nationalism is one of our 5 interlocking injustices, we came out as a state. We had Los Angeles Poor People's Campaign came together, but the whole state came together. We had over 60 faith leaders do a Facebook Live meeting condemning his thing. We wrote letters to the governor, to the mayor, to the supervisors in LA, trying to get them to at least protect the residents of Skid Row. There are about 3,000 unhoused neighbors in the Skid Row area, and he was going to have this worship protest without people wearing masks or maintaining social distance, because he believes that Jesus will protect you, and if you wear a mask, that proves that you're not a good Christian. So we didn't manage to stop him entirely, but we definitely made an impact. So one of our local partners is 5 for 15, and we have done a lot of work with McDonald's and other fast food employees who are being asked to work in really unsafe conditions during COVID. And we've done several actions with a McDonald's in Oakland on Telegraph. And I was just yesterday in Santa Clara supporting a worker at a McDonald's there. It's an ongoing problem, and there's the FAST Act in our state legislature that you might pay attention to and support your fast food neighbors. So locally, we do things like car caravans, which is a good social distance way to show up. Inspired by the Moral Monday caravans that were organized in Kentucky and Washington, D.C., folks all over the country had car caravans. And so this is a picture of the one that took our demands to Senators Harris and Feinstein, calling for them to fight for the full and just stimulus relief package. We are really lucky to have a fellow named David Solnit in our community who's an amazing artist, and he does these teams of artists doing things. So this was a in conjunction with the Cardboard and Concrete Unhoused Artists Collective, we did a street mural in solidarity with folks facing eviction and displacement. Of course, Oakland power washed it the next day, but we showed up. They promised they wouldn't power wash this one. This was a couple block long in front of the federal building in Oakland, Choose Democracy, Get Ready to Stop a Coup event, featured music, mural painting, training, and helped to get communities organized and strong-hearted and ready for a positive action to stop a possible coup during the November federal elections, not that long before the January thing. So one of those circles is a Poor People's Campaign circle. There were about 14 organizations working on this mural together. And then we did another one. This is one of our, this is our circle in a more recent mural that was just done as a climate justice event with the indigenous community and many other climate activists, 1,000 grandmothers and what have you. And so this is the kind of thing that we do in the Bay Area. So what's happening right now? Over 84,000 people have signed the Move On petition. We're trying to get to 100,000, so we're still working on that. On Moral Monday, March 15th, that's tomorrow, there'll be delegations delivering our demands to state houses around the country. We'll be focusing on voter suppression. And lest you think this is a problem in other states, there are currently 2 voter suppression bills in the California State Senate, SB 511 and SB 597. SB 511 is about voter file maintenance, there's a law about if you are found incompetent to be a juror, you can no longer vote. And they're going to basically make the people who do jury eligibility do it for everybody and as a way to kick out voters. And then SB 597 is about requiring that the identification envelope have a verification panel where the voter has to put the last 4 digits of their driver's license, state ID, or Social Security, requiring another check by election officials of mail-in ballots and one more way to keep people off the voter rolls. So we have a memorial wall. If you've lost someone you care about to COVID-19 or poverty, we urge you to add their names. It's an amazing list. And of course, Moral Mondays, this is how to get to them. And like I say, tomorrow it's on voter suppression, but it's been, last week it was on women leaders, and the week before it was on environmental issues. And so check our website. There's all kinds of interesting things going on. And to find out more about us, there's the Poor People's Campaign website. Check out the Take Action section. There are YouTube channels for the Poor People's Campaign, Repairers of the Breach, and the Kairos Center, which are the 2 sponsoring organizations. So you can't just go to the Poor People's Campaign stuff. And that's actually true for documents. The Kairos Center in particular makes lots of amazing documents on poverty. Reverend Liz has written a book about poverty. She came out of the homeless union, is what her background was. She'd worked for years with the poor in New York State. And of course, we're on Facebook and Twitter. And the way that people get involved with the campaign generally is by following us or by joining one of our working groups. And we have a faith leaders outreach working group, a legal working group, an art, culture, and musicology working group, the speaker training working group, from which Masen and I come, an outreach and inclusion working group, a policy and political education working group, and a structure working group. So if you'd like to get involved in any of those, please write us at info@poorpeoplescampaignbayarea.org. And I want to share one more video because music is so incredibly important to our campaign. Like I said, there's an arts and theomusicology working group. We're continually writing chants, making signs, planning online campaigns. And so this song, Everybody's Got a Right to Live, which you saw on the sign a few slides back, was actually written in Resurrection City in 1968 by the Reverend Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick and Jimmy Collier. And this is a very updated version of it. And it's sung by the New York PPC. So they have a group of songs called Songs in the Key of Resistance. The main vocalists are Sharon Weber, Clara Taylor, Pauline Pisano, and the spoken word is Lou Aya.
Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody's got a right to live.
I feel this melody in the footsteps of the people, rising up in the rhythm of dignity and courage. When I see you, I suddenly believe liberation can flourish, and generosity and humility will save us. And we will use the love our mamas gave us to decolonize the skies above us with praises. Learning from the bravest, the beautiful, nameless creators of a world newly awakened. We on fire and blazing our way out the matrix, guided by a single mother's hand, holding her family together. We already on the other side of never. We're the aunties brewing tea and sipping sweetness from the south to the north. We are here to remind those in DC who they working for. That's right, beloved. This song is Freedom Uncovered.
Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody's got a right to live.
What Harriet walked towards, what the people in Selma marched for, what the riots from Stonewall to Ferguson to Minneapolis fought for. A movement of people who pour in dollars but rich in brilliance. We are the millions, the healers who come to heal, the leaders who come to reveal that the right to live means you've had the right to feel what you feel. The right to live means an end to police violence and the passage of a Green New Deal. The right to live is in the wind, and every day we witness in our children's countless talents. The right to live is harmonizing in the voice of Yara Allen. It is the springtime and you can feel the right to live about to bloom, growing out the organizing of comrades like Sierra and Sharon and Claudia de la Cruz. Esto es el momento de pararnos como madres orgullosas y sonreír, porque no hay nada más esencial que el derecho de vivir. The right to live is a simple truth to return us to ourselves. It is a spell being cast upon a lost and divided nation to heal the wounds of hate and incarceration with a love so bold it includes everybody. Feel that, everybody. And when you fight for those rights, they become the lights for us to follow through these long dark nights. This is a promise to be radically honest and declare we are worthy of food to eat and housing to sleep in and schools to dream in and just being human beings. We are worthy of love, and so the Poor People's Campaign has come to bring our freedom into being. You will know we've arrived because you will hear us sing.
Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live.
Okay. So in the Poor People's Campaign, we say forward together, and then people respond, not one step back. I know we're all muted, so I won't ask you to chant with me, but forward together, not one step back. And if you would like to contribute to the Poor People's Campaign, here is some information about donations, which I also sent to Alex. And that is what we have to share. Are there any questions?
All right. If you have any questions, go ahead and raise your hand in the Zoom meeting. Oh. I don't see any hands yet. Here we go. Dick Hewitson.
Hi, thank you very much. That was an amazing presentation, and I just have all kinds of questions. But the thing that I feel so strongly about in this is that things are said about like war economy and poverty, and these are words we rarely hear. But one of my questions is, in all the work you've done with people in Congress, for instance, or state legislatures, have you had any positive results?
Well, we are in conversation with the Biden administration, and we're in conversation with the Biden transition team. So we do have at least the ear of some politicians, but we're really trying to organize poor people. For instance, we don't allow politicians of any level to sit on poor people's campaign committees because it's not about Republican, Democrat, Green, Independent, whatever. It's about right and wrong, and we want to lift up the people who are currently in poverty. And so my experience of delivering demands to the state capitol was what we did. We delivered the demands, and they sort of said, thanks. But we are also, we're not an organization, we're an organism. We don't, we're not a 501c3, as you could probably see, we have fiscal sponsors. We are trying to change the narrative by changing the narrator. And so it's really interesting. We'll go to these things, like we'll want to talk to the governor, and they'll say, okay, you two leaders can come in. And we're like, that's not the way we work. We have affected people with us, and they're the ones you need to hear from. And so we bring in the people with stories to tell. So testimonies by poor people are a huge part of what we bring to people. I think you probably saw a little bit of that from the videos we showed. But you saw the changes that the 68 campaign made, even though it was cut off so prematurely. I think that there is the potential. Yes, fight for 15, the $15 minimum wage was taken out of this current bill, but we're not going to stop fighting. 15 is not even a reasonable wage. We're fighting at the 68 campaign for a $2 wage, which would be $15 today with inflation. So it's a fight that is going to keep going. And I think that's true of most of the fights. And we do have a lot of Veterans for Peace, a lot of folks affected by the war economy, and also 53 cents on the dollar of our taxes goes to the war economy. So if we stop pouring all that money into weapons, what could we do for the people who need it, who need childcare and education and the values that we're working on? And so it's definitely an issue that we're really concerned about. And of course, that's how I got involved in the Poor People's Campaign. I'm one of the people in the local Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in San Jose. And they said, you should go to this Congress, this moral Congress in DC in June 2019. And I went to all the programming on militarism and the war economy because that's what WILF is about. And so I assure you that that's a big issue that people are actually working on.
One of my concerns, because I agree with everything you're saying, however, it's very obvious the way our country operates that money controls what happens. And poor people can't bring money.
That's true, but we can bring numbers. And I think that when it comes to getting elected, money matters, but so do voters. And voter suppression, like I say, there are 2 bills in the California legislature right now trying to suppress the vote. That's how the Republicans get elected. They've said, if everybody votes, we won't get elected, because they're not, I don't want to get political about it, but because it's not just them. There's Democrats who are equally uncaring about their actual constituents. And I don't know how to fix it, but we're trying to do what we can, which is we mobilize voters all over the nation. Lots of text banking, lots of phone calling, lots of programming, trying to get poor. And our document that we created with, I don't remember whether that was the Policy Institute, the most recent one, shows that the margins in different areas can be overturned if the poor people who aren't currently voting because they're not hearing their issues spoken about actually get out and vote. We have the numbers to change electoral politics. So yes, money is incredibly important, and that's what we don't have. That's why we need to organize.
Thank you.
Okay. Kanita, you got a question? Kanita, can you unmute yourself? Don't know.
Did that work?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, there's a button in a different place. Anyway, I guess, let's see, to make these questions, how can you be sure that I've seen a lot in these different slides and so on about God. How can you make sure that what was oppressing poor people isn't going to end up oppressing non-believers?
It's true that the co-chairs, the co-chairs of our campaign are both Christians, but you know me, Kanita, I'm a Wiccan. I'm perfectly comfortable in the campaign. I have met Muslims and Jews and Sikhs and Hindus and every other faith and non-faith. One of the people who is a co-chair. So one of the ways that the campaign is organized that really excites me is that every state committee has tri-chairs, an affected person, a faith leader, and an organizer. And one of our tri-chairs, our affected person, is a person of no religion. She's one of the top 3, actually 4, because we're so big, we have 4 instead of the usual tri-chairs, but is a person of no religion. And that is not a problem in the campaign.
And one other thing is, the whole point of this is to bring up people who are in poverty. And I suppose it seems like what that is it's taking the heavy weights off the people who are poor, which would also take down the things that are floating up, all the 0.1% at the top. But it seems like it could easily end up dragging down some of the people in the middle class, which is a lot of the people that you would actually need in order to do the work of pulling the people up. And it seems, I don't know, I guess it's, I don't see necessarily rising tide lifting all the ships? And because that doesn't seem to be a lot of the what they're working towards. They just seem to be about, the poor people are upset about not having their fair share.
I think that if you look at please read the moral budget. I think that you'll see that it's taking money from things, not from the middle class, but from things like the bloated military budget. And I think that the middle class could have a much benefit from having their education not cost. I don't know about you, but my daughter had to pay 50 times to go to college what I had to pay back in my day. I mean, everything is so out of control that there need to be systemic changes. And that's what we're talking about, is systemic changes, systemic poverty, people who are kept down by the way the government administers poverty programs, people who are kept down by not having a living wage. You shouldn't have to work 4 jobs to not be in the poverty level. And so one of the things we're asking for is actually the poverty measure was created in the 1960s and has never been updated. The official poverty measure, there is a supplemental poverty measure that the Census Department created that's a little bit more realistic, but the official poverty measure says that you're in poverty if you make less than $11,000 a year as an individual, or $21,000 a year as a family of 4. It's not realistic. And these systemic things are what need to change. We need to get real numbers. We need to have programs that will lift everybody. And so I would disagree that what we're doing would in any way hurt the middle class.
Thanks.
All right. Chuck, you have a question?
Thank you. Yeah, the earlier question I had was around the religion and how we're keeping that separate in this organization. So thank you for answering that. How about the definition of poor? How do people, are they self-identifying? Is there a threshold? I know we get into that a lot with, especially around the Bay Area, what's considered poor here versus other parts of the country. And I agree, $15 an hour is a basic wage everywhere, but in some parts of California, that's going to still keep you on the poor side of things.
Absolutely. Yeah, and in fact, in California, the current minimum wage for non-tip workers is $13 an hour, and will go up to $15 by 2025. So the federal thing isn't going to help us unless it gets bigger. And I won't say that religion is not part of the Poor People's Campaign. It is definitely something that gets mentioned, and there are sections of the campaign for faith leaders to mobilize them, to help mobilize their congregations. There's also something called the Freedom Church of the Poor, which I haven't looked into because, like I say, I'm not Christian or Jewish or Muslim, and so I'm not particularly interested in going to a Freedom Church of the Poor. So there, you will have to hear religious language, people talking about the least of these and things like that in the narrative of the Poor People's Campaign. But I'm basically a meliorist, which means I believe it's possible to make the world a better place. And this is a group of people who are out there putting their bodies on the line in the streets, trying to make the world a better place. And so when I went to the Congress in June 2019, I was like, I have found my people, despite the fact that, yeah, there are a lot of Christians, there are a lot of, religious language, but they are really dedicated people. We are really dedicated people trying to make the world a better place for everyone.
All right. I don't see anybody else with their hands up at the moment. Probably means we can move into the general discussion and allow anybody to talk. Hold on. Before we do that, We do have a question from Dana and Jerry. So I don't know who. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I think you made a statement about having a lot of support from the general public. And I have a question about that, which is that I would have thought that Bernie would be more supportive of the Poor People's Campaign than Biden. And I've heard that most people agree with Bernie on a lot of issues, but Bernie did not win the Democratic primary. Care to comment on that?
No. Personally, I'm a registered Green. I do pay attention to national politics, but I am neither a follower of Bernie nor Biden particularly, but Biden is who we have to work with at the moment, and his team is being receptive. Although you'll note they have not yet said the word poverty. They're still talking about rising the middle class. So we still have a lot of work to do even there.
Dana and I are also Green, and Dana has been or is a member of WILF too. Peninsula, though.
Awesome. Uh-huh.
All right. Back to Chuck.
Yeah, just to follow up, I had two parts to that last question. One was around how they're defining poverty. Is it
right
when they go into a community? Are they just having people self-identify, or is it based on government, or how do they target their efforts? I guess what I'm saying, to align with who's truly poor in a given area.
We tend to use the supplemental poverty measure, which is the one that the census created, which is it takes into account expenses as well as income, whereas the official poverty measure only takes income into account. And so we think the supplemental poverty measure does a better job, but that's one of our demands, is we need to update the poverty measures to be meaningful, because they just currently aren't. And so that is definitely something that we're looking at, and that is one of our demands. And so when we go into an area, we tend to go into the neighborhoods, into the areas that are identified in that city, hamlet, whatever, Marks, Mississippi, the poorest hamlet in the poorest state, was one of the wagon trains that went up to the Poor People's Campaign in 1968. And we're, still targeting folks that need help. And so we work with the unhoused, we work with the poor, and I think there are some pretty clear measures of things. You live in Cancer Alley, you're dying, your politicians are not doing anything to help. You've got those huge medical bills, you're poor. So it's a varied thing, and the injustices are interlocking. Environmental causes of poverty, health causes of poverty. It's an analysis that is not simple. And so like Judy Woodruff in that PBS video was, you're asking for too much. What are you talking about? And we're saying, yeah, we're asking for everything, because these interlocking injustices, it's like Reverend Barber has said things like, African Americans in this country have been waiting for 400 years for decent pay. And it's what we fight for. And so there isn't a good measure of poverty at the moment. And so, but we do tend to use the supplemental poverty measure as our main way of producing statistics, because like Reverend Barber said, if you don't have data, you can't make demands. Making demands in a vacuum doesn't make sense. You have to be able to support your demands with actual data, and that's why we commission so many studies and are doing position papers and white papers, especially at the Cairo Center, continually, because of ever-changing things. But we hope that the administration will update the poverty measures.
Okay. we are right at about 12:30, so we usually move to the general discussion. So I think we should go ahead and do that, but then Senna and Alex have their hand up, so they can be the first one to start the general discussion. So go ahead. Looks like Alex, maybe.
Yeah, I was thinking. What I'm seeing is after the last election, the country is still pretty divided, which is sort of good in the sense that the Democratic Party seems to have a stronger progressive wing, and that helps somewhat. I was wondering what kind of reaction you see to the Poor People's Campaign in the red states and the people who voted for Trump. I think a lot of his initial support was for people who felt they were being left out, and they might be fertile ground, but I was wondering if you could comment on that.
I'm not sure how well we do with Trump voters. I know that we have pushes into rural areas in particular because there's a lot of rural poverty. And we are getting traction in areas, but I'm not in a place where I'm personally working on that issue, so I don't really know.
Okay. I was wondering if there seem to be conflicting priorities there, I guess. And I would think that there'd be a good push to make voting easier, although that's kind of been demonized by the Republican Party as creating uncertainty. Yeah, we'll discuss this next week, actually. By the way, I took the data on your card and I put it in the chat box. It takes up a lot of space, but if people want to download the chats, there are a lot of links. You kind of wonder where to begin, right? But I figured I'd go to the poorpeoplescampaign.org, and I assume everything else mentioned there can be accessed from that website. Is that correct?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, actually, you sent the info card only to me, but Masen did post most of it in the chat. So if people save the chat, they will still get it. I wondered what that was about.
You should know that already.
But so I think saving the chat, it will still get you the data because Masen was posting it as the slides were on the screen. So thank you. And
yeah, I just want to say, I think I loved your question, Alex, just in general about rural areas and potentially this being a way to reach certain, Republican voters or Trump voters. I think the campaign is pretty disciplined in its nonpartisan, like transpartisan orientation, and realizing that poor people are everywhere, in all states and all cities, and people are complex and hold a variety of different beliefs. So we want to, unite the poor, and that's part of what Dr. King's original, message was. Is if we're only focused on, mobilize a certain group or certain part of the electorate, we can't accomplish that much. But as a fusion movement, we can do a lot more. So it's tough for like Reverend Rowan and I being in, the Bay Area in California and not necessarily, seeing what's happening on the front lines in other states or in rural areas. But the campaign's been pretty good so far about sharing those testimonies and keeping us in the loop.
I have an idea I'd like to contribute, which is like, I'm afraid, very simplistic. But why couldn't we just have a box on everyone's tax form? Would you like to donate 1% of your income to the poor. And I'm wondering how many people would be willing to do that. You know, I don't know, but it seems to me that even just 1% of the income of every person that checked that box would make some significant money available to help poor people. And I think that the ease of it and the simplicity and the straightforwardness of directly addressing the problem by just giving some money would help a lot.
Well, if you could deduct it from your taxes, I think people would probably do it.
I'm really sorry. I understood there to be a hard stop at 12:30, and I have a service to participate in at 1. So I'm going to leave you with Masen, if I may. And thank you very much for inviting us.
Thank you.
Hope to see you again soon.
Okay.
Thank you.